Hello and welcome to China Focus. I'm Shelley Zhang. Now, pollution in China has become such a big issue that even Captain Planet himself might have a hard time solving it. Over the weekend in Beijing, air pollution was literally off the charts. So bad, it was beyond the scale used to measure it. It reached what the U.S. Embassy, which measures air pollution in Beijing, used to call crazy bad levels, 12 times higher than the acceptable standard even in China. That led to a predictable public outcry, but even state-run media has been reporting aggressively on the pollution issue. Now, is this a sign that the leadership will actually take a meaningful stance against pollution? Here today to talk about that, we have Matt Gnesta. So the pollution issue in China, it made news over the weekend because of an extreme occurrence. But what's it usually like in Beijing? Is it pretty bad according to U.S. standards?
Certainly it's bad according to U.S. standards. I mean, just look at this map. This is a satellite image from NASA, and it shows basically the U.S. in blue. This is measuring PM 2.5, which is the smallest particles, the ones that are considered most harmful. And we can see that China, especially this region of Beijing, Tianjin, Shanghai, and Chongqing, are dark red. The pollution is really bad. But it's not just in Beijing, it's also all across China. In fact, in Zhejiang province, which is near Shanghai, the pollution was so bad that over the weekend, a factory caught fire. It was on fire for 3 hours before anyone even noticed because the smog was so thick. So it's pretty much bad all over. Of the world's 10 most polluted cities, by one standard, 7 of them are in China. 1% of China's 500 biggest cities, only 1% of China's 500 biggest cities actually meet World Health Organization pollution standards. So it's quite bad across pretty much the whole country.
So let's talk about the effects of the issue. Are we talking from like a public health standpoint? Is it, how harmful is this for people to be breathing every day?
Well, it's, a young, strong, healthy person can certainly withstand it for, a period of time. But the biggest impact is on children, the elderly, and especially people with lung problems or heart problems. And a study published by Greenpeace in December 2012 basically estimated that in 4 Chinese cities, the number of deaths just from pollution in 1 year would be about 8,500. That's 8,500 additional people dying just because China's pollution is so bad. And the economic impact, it estimated, was $1.08 billion. More than $1 billion of economic impact as well. So this is very significant, and it certainly has a big impact. And that Greenpeace study was only looking at 4 cities.
So it might be even more widespread across China.
Certainly, and there's more polluted cities. Even, for example, your hometown of Lanzhou is China's most polluted city, and that wasn't even measured by the Greenpeace study.
Well, I'm proud to be from Lanzhou in that case. People seem surprised in this case at the response from state-run media. I mean, people were talking on the internet about complaining about the air, things like that, but state-run media seemed to be especially aggressive this time. Even Xinwen Lianbo, the flagship CCTV evening news broadcast, was reporting on this the day that it happened. Is this surprising to you?
In the sense of, if you look at the last 10 years, it's not been that common for state-run media to report on it. Although last year we started to see a little bit of an increase in this. In fact, in February of 2012, there was an article published in Xinhua that talked about water pollution, mentioning that 40% of China's water is undrinkable. 20% is what they call Category 5, that is so toxic you can't even touch it. And that's probably an underestimate because the US EPA said it was much higher than that. But basically, it does show that Chinese state-run media has been sort of talking about the issue of pollution. So it's not the first time, but it's certainly significant in that we did see it on a pretty widespread scale. And I think, once CCTV's flagship evening news program talks about pollution, it's kind of fair game for all the rest of them. But there's certain boundaries that they're not going to cross. We've seen state media urging the government to take action, but what they're not doing is a more fundamental criticism of the Communist Party or the way they've handled this over the decades. It's more like, the government should do well moving forward. So it's a very forward thing, but not looking at all the problems that had been created and why.
Now, a lot of people have been saying, does this have anything to do with the power transition in terms of, pledges of greater transparency? Is this coverage of pollution indication that there's going to be greater transparency over issues like this?
I think the central government wants to have more reporting about pollution. And this is a little bit, opposite of what you might think. Instead of their normal MO is to just cover things up. But the central government actually has tried to crack down on polluters in China for many years, but they've been ineffective. And a lot of that has to do with, there's been regulations for a long time. There was a set of regulations issued in 2008, basically almost totally ineffective, because even if the central government wants to try to curb pollution, on a local level it's so corrupt, and the local officials are in business with the factory owners. They own stock in the companies, and there isn't really a system for addressing that. One of the things that has enabled the U.S. to really clean up pollution over the last 50 years is, even though the U.S. government, you could say the U.S. is a weak state and China is a strong state, but actually the U.S. is more effective in regulating environmental pollution. Why? Well, one reason is that you have democratic elections of officials even at the local level, and also you have a free press. So when there's a pollution problem, the press can report on it. I think that in this case, the central authorities are trying to sort of experiment with allowing the press to criticize the pollution as a way to enable them to crack down more on the polluters. But keep in mind, this isn't coming from a sort of environmental consciousness so much as it is coming from the idea of trying to maintain social stability, because there's so many protests in China that the more the pollution is, the more it's a threat to the overall stability of the Communist Party.
Well, I was going to ask about that because in the past it seemed that pollution can be kind of a sensitive issue. Even just this past June, it became almost a diplomatic incident when the foreign ministry was criticizing the U.S. embassy for releasing their own pollution statistics.
It's like, how dare you monitor our air?
Well, they were saying, according to the Geneva Conventions, this is wrong. You shouldn't be doing this. This is interfering with our internal affairs. So they were kind of, making it a big deal that, you shouldn't be monitoring it. We're doing a fine job. But in the last few months, we've seen increasing numbers of these kind of localized protests over pollution, not so much air pollution, but more factory pollution or water pollution in local areas. And in those cases, local officials have backed down. Is that a sense that, pollution is becoming less sensitive to talk about?
Well, I suppose it depends what area you're talking about. I mean, there's those protests in Ningbo, which is just south of Shanghai, that happened in October. And residents there were protesting against the expansion of a chemical plant. And there were big protests. It was publicized in the media. There was footage uploaded to social media. And yes, authorities did back down. But in the same month, there were protests over a similar type of, coal-producing plant type incident in Hainan, which is the island that kind of nobody pays a whole lot of attention to. And in that case, the police came with riot gear and tear gas and broke up the protests. So when there's a lot of attention focused, especially from the national or the international media and people online, the authorities have to kind of take a little bit of a softer stance because they want to sort of maintain that level of social stability. But overall, it's not necessarily been, open reporting on all sorts of pollution.
So you wouldn't interpret this as kind of a backing off on the pollution issue in general?
It's not transparency, it's strategic, and there's a big difference. Strategically, they want to allow media to report on pollution in a certain way because it actually empowers the new leadership to crack down on polluters and enforce regulations, thereby maintaining greater social stability.
So let me ask about, one of the arguments that people have made in the past is that it's not fair to criticize China as a developing nation. We're talking about, having other countries like the U.S. Criticize China's pollution levels because, the U.S. in the past had their opportunity to kind of pollute while they were developing. So, China now needs to develop, so they need kind of almost more leeway than industrialized countries to pollute. Now, what do you think about that?
It's certainly correct that the U.S., especially in the early 20th century, was a major polluter. Certain cities like Pittsburgh, for example, were, people compared it to hell with the lid off. It was so polluted you could, your clothes would be dark with soot by the end of the day. But as for calling it, the U.S. had their opportunity to pollute, I think that's kind of ludicrous because we know a lot more about how to control pollution now with technology than we did, 50 or 100 years ago.
But it more seems like the argument is that, we need to develop, therefore we need to, have these heavy coal producing industries, things like that. We need to be able to grow before we can clean that up.
There are lots of types of development that don't require heavy pollution. Let's look at South Korea, for example, which really industrialized over the last 50 years. Actually, there was a lot of pollution in the first couple decades of that, 60s and 70s. In the 90s, they started regulating the pollution and cleaned that up a lot in South Korea. And actually, the GDP didn't seem to be directly affected by that. And South Korea is now a very developed country compared to China, with a whole lot less pollution and less pollution, per land area per capita. Other countries have also similarly made a lot of strides in terms of their development without causing major environmental pollution. The problem with the pollution is you've also got a lot of externalities that are now affecting economic growth in China.
So a lot of the things that Beijing's been doing are kind of short-term fixes, temporarily closing factories, taking government cars off the road to decrease the smog. What are the long-term things that they're going to do here?
Well, I think they want to do something long-term, but it's unclear whether they actually can. By contrast, Hong Kong, the chief executive, who's been under fire for a lot of things, but he's actually pledged $1.3 billion to take longer-term effective measures on pollution, such as subsidies for getting new, more cleaner vehicles, getting old vehicles off the road that are major polluters. Mainland China hasn't done anything like that, and they maybe don't have the power to do it. I think the central authorities, they do want to clean things up for the sake of social stability, but it's unlikely that they're going to be able to solve some of the more fundamental corruption problems that are underlying the whole pollution on a national scale.
Okay, well, thank you for joining us today to talk about this issue, and thank you for watching. For more on this and other issues in China, join us at ntd.tv.